There are people, you may have heard some of them, who said this was campaign rhetoric, or you can't always believe Trump, or wait and see. Well, tonight I can tell you the time for that kind of talk and waiting is over. House Republicans are using their government power to go after a conservative official who investigated the January 6th insurrection. Before I get to what they're doing, I want to begin with the facts. Imagine that. Fact number one. All members of Congress, regardless of party, have wide legal protection from prosecution for the work they do inside Congress, for what they say on the House floor or how they carry out their duties on a committee. It is a very high bar for the government in a different branch to prosecute a lawmaker for that kind of work, for those activities, unless you really find something like evidence, say, of bribery to sell government activity. We have seen members of both parties get in that kind of trouble. It relates to their government work, but it is a high bar. Fact number two, there is no such public evidence right now against any of the members of the January 6th committee. Fact number three, Congresswoman Liz Cheney spent her career as a Republican. Most people who follow politics are aware of that. She even rose to the GOP's leadership in the Trump era. She backed Donald Trump in 2020. But as you may have heard, he's been vowing revenge against her over her actual work in Congress. What I just told you about, that's usually protected material, protected activity. Liz Cheney today, I can tell you, is saying that January 6th revealed Donald Trump to be a cruel and vindictive man, and that his Republican allies in Congress are now fabricating lies and, quote, defamatory allegations in an attempt to cover up what Trump did. Now, that reference to defamation suggests one way that Cheney could potentially push back against attacks on her if she views them as defamatory and wants to go to civil courts to get justice for that. Now, to why we're talking about this right now. Tonight, Liz Cheney is responding to efforts to go after her in this period before Trump even takes office as House Republicans. Her former colleagues demand that she be criminally investigated by the FBI for her work, which they know all about. It's work they also do. It's work she did in Congress alongside them, whether they disagree on certain matters. The congressional work, a co-equal branch of government, of investigating the attack on their workplace, the Capitol, on January 6th, when Trump fans turned it into a crime scene. And in the hours after those now convicted attackers, some of them seditionists, were finally removed and ejected, remember, many top Republicans flatly condemned that violence.
We will not be kept out of this chamber by thugs, mobs, or threats.
Chaos, anarchy. The violence today was wrong and un-American.
All I can say is count me out. Enough is enough.
Those are just some of the Republicans who were condemning the attack that night. Again, they were condemning the thing that Donald Trump helped foment and that Liz Cheney and others later investigated inside of Congress. Remember, Trump's political vendetta is now being, as I mentioned, pursued by House Republicans. They are laying the groundwork. It is precisely the kind of, quote, lawfare that Republicans have claimed to be against. They use that word lawfare as a reference to what they view as politically targeted prosecutions. And that is quite clearly, notwithstanding the potential hypocrisy, what some of them are now arguing for against Liz Cheney because Donald Trump is mad at her. I don't mean to minimize the seriousness of this, but that's kind of what it boils down to, except he wants people to abuse power on his behalf next year. So Republicans, this is the update I mentioned at the top of the hour. I gave you the context and the facts for why it's hard to just go after lawmakers this way under law, but Republicans are calling for an FBI investigation. They've issued a new report, one member, Loudermilk, going as far as to claim the committee's work with witnesses was some kind of possible federal crime. The language is that federal laws were, quote, likely broken by Liz Cheney. That's the allegation. And this is a playbook that predates Trump. Republicans have long used Congress to try to push or launder or pressure separate parts of the government in the executive branch and FBI and DOJ. Some of the efforts seem to get traction. Remember, what everyone thinks of James Comey, and he has critics across the spectrum, It was Republican pressure against him and demands that he brief them on things that they said needed even more investigation relating to Hillary Clinton's emails and other matters, and demanding those probes that led Comey to be writing letters back. Some of those, you may remember, were a big issue in 2016. But the history of that was Republicans pushing the FBI, just as they demanded investigations of even sometimes mid and low-level officials who worked for President Bill Clinton, if you go back that far. Other times, these efforts flounder. There were many claims made about possible or hypothetical Biden-Ukrainian corruption deals. Those boomeranged so much, were found to be so baseless, that the feds ended up indicting a source, of informant, for lying about those kind of apparently politicized claims that were designed to go after Biden, even if the evidence wasn't there. Now the playbook, as I'm reporting for you, it runs right alongside Trump. And he repeats the calls I just mentioned against Liz Cheney coming from the House with his own posts. He's here saying the FBI must investigate. This is new. That quote there is, he posted that online. Now, one thing legally, if our system and the guardrails and the courts hold, is that kind of demand could boomerang on Donald Trump. And I can tell you exactly how. If there is such a probe later, and judges view that as evidence of a demand for selective political prosecution, go after the opponents, well, that could end those whole cases. It could get things tossed. If Trump's incoming FBI pick, if confirmed, is seen as following what is essentially an order from the president-elect issued in public, online, in broad daylight, if that's the reason the probe was started or other potential misconduct occurs, judges tend to view that very negatively. Now, no one is above being investigated in a system of rule of law, but those investigations are always supposed to begin with evidence of a crime and never with a target of just some person that the president or the governor or whomever wants to go after. Trump's seeming confession on this point is that he wants the FBI to abuse power, and as I'm reminding you, this is a new one. He's saying this after the campaign, not something that's as easily dismissed as campaign rhetoric. If he wants the FBI to become his personal political police force, there are a lot of ways and a lot of parts of the government that last longer than the next 4 years that are designed to prevent exactly that. Now, you can't chalk up that new post I showed you to campaign rhetoric, which is something that I think some judges have entertained. To give you one example, in the litigation over the travel ban, which was previously sold on the campaign trail as a, quote, Muslim ban by Donald Trump, there were judges, and they're not MAGA judges or just looking to help him, but there were judges who said, we're not going to take campaign rhetoric about the travel ban and treat it as the same as what he said after the election when he's actually starting to govern. Well, here we are now after the election. As for the past attacks on, say, Liz Cheney and others, well, you've probably seen them. Those also definitely cross lines, legal or otherwise, is for judges to decide, but some of them were quite severe, with Trump saying about Cheney things like this.
Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. Everybody on that committee, for what they did, honestly, they should go to jail.
What they did on a bipartisan basis, remember, there was a lot of effort to make it a bipartisan investigative committee, was talk to witnesses. Many of the key witnesses worked for Donald Trump and were, like Cheney once was, pretty lifelong Republicans, people who agreed with many of Donald Trump's policies. That's what the committee did. And Liz Cheney had an impact, not just on the committee, but really in American life, precisely because her family has this Republican history. And she has this career as an arch conservative. And so for many people, that simply proved that her opposition to Donald Trump's January 6th coup attempt and later assorted efforts to hide it, that it was based on principle, precisely because it was Liz Cheney. It was not some political or ideological disagreement that morphed into something larger. She backed Donald Trump for office in the campaign. She was in Republican leadership. She clearly backed most of his conservative domestic policies. She only broke over the January 6th insurrection. The Biden White House could thwart much of this with pardons for the January 6th investigators and others. We just heard this week from a lawyer supporting that idea. Take a listen.
It's time, I think, to think about whether or not existing authorities need to be applied in new and different ways because Trump is a new and different threat. It's at least incumbent upon Biden morally and ethically to protect those who are at risk because they were on his side.
Your view of that proposal?
You know, look, I understand people's concern. I think it's a fair point to raise. The fact that the January 6th committee members themselves are telling us that they don't really want them or are concerned about these cases, I think that ought to be weighed very heavily in the balance here. I think the odds that any kind of investigation would get very far and charged by a grand jury and brought to trial and result in a jury conviction, particularly if the facts were as Loudermilk alleged them, I don't think any of those things would happen because the case would be in D.C. I don't even think the grand jury would return an indictment if the allegations that Loudermilk outlined were presented to them. I understand the concern, but, if you have Adam Kinzinger who's going around saying, and I think articulating well, that these are not things that they should be super concerned about. They're going to be resolved in the courts, and particularly in the jurisdictions where they would be brought, like D.C., those jurisdictions are very blue, and the judges at both the trial and appellate levels are very solid.